Enjoy a seat at the table for great conversation and good company.
Welcome to And Good Company. I'm Sarah Fiedelholtz. We all know a great dinner party isn't really about the food. It's about the people seated around the table engaging in lively discussion. And Good Company gives you the opportunity to enjoy a seat at the table and watch smart and interesting conversations as they happen. I am pleased to be in the company of Michael Brown, the Executive Director of the Indiana Jewish Historical Society. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So let's start with understanding what exactly is the Indiana Jewish Historical Society and what its purpose is.
So the Indiana Jewish Historical Society collects, archives, and interprets Indiana's Jewish past for future generations. We were established in 1972 here in Fort Wayne, Indiana. We're currently located in Indianapolis, and we have board members and members throughout the entire state.
And let's talk about this idea of why history and the preservation of history is important. And you talked about it's for really providing for people who don't know or understand things, but also ensuring that marginalized groups are not forgotten. Can you explain to me what you mean by that and why that's important?
I think that if you're a marginalized group and your history has a tendency to get lost. So there's this big thing that people say, this old cliche that winners write the history books. But I would actually edit that and say that those who have primary sources write our history books. And so if we don't save primary sources, we're losing our history and critical perspectives that might otherwise not be there. One of the problems is that people who write history books tend to have the ideas of the majority society. And so if you're a marginalized group, your opinions and your ideas won't reflect in the educational institutions that are out there who are learning about the past.
And the idea of primary sources, just so you know, people remembered when they did their research papers. So a primary source are things that are directly from the person who experienced it or was there at the event. So it would be the actual people and then getting their recollections or their mementos or anything that they have that captures that time in history, correct?
Correct. So a great example would be a newspaper clipping from that time period, a magazine from that time period.
But wouldn't those in some ways be secondhand sources? Because it would be the people who were interviewed in those articles that would be the primary sources?
It would only become a secondary source if it was written after the fact. So if it was written during the event, while the events were happening, or covering a news story at that time,
then
it would still be a primary source.
Okay.
Or it could be letters, it could be correspondence, it could be a diary. There are photographs that were taken.
The booklets or pamphlets that were given out at various events,
exactly,
things like that.
Advertisements,
Right.
Things of that nature. And those really form the basis of going back to cite different sources. So, a secondary source would be talking about the primary source. And is considered a little bit less reliable by academics. Mm-hmm. And then you could also look at oral history. So this interview we're doing right now is kind of a primary source of today, but the history we're talking about, the past, is a secondary source. Right. So what we're doing right now is both a primary and a secondary source simultaneously in a way.
So when people are going to write about Michael Brown and all that he's accomplished in his life, somebody might be looking up this interview in 30 years. So
right.
Now,
right.
Most people know about historical preservation in terms of architecture and why it's important to preserve buildings from the past and what their purposes were and to keep them within a community. Talk about the idea of, in this context of historical preservation, why it is so important to collect all of these materials.
So there are different historians and different takes on history. There are certain historians that love the history of architecture. They love preserving architecture. They love preserving buildings and spaces, and that's really their way of interpreting and looking at history. And then there's other historians who love oral histories, and then people who love archives.
But the overall idea of preserving these materials and the idea of maybe in the framework of legacy, is that partly why it's important?
I think that you can really understand perhaps the intentions of a city's planner, or there are bits and pieces of the past that you can find in the building. Looking around here in Fort Wayne, what was the purpose of this building? Why was it built in the way that it was? Why was the city planned in the way it was? We talk a lot today about redlining in different cities and what areas had covenantal grants that kept African Americans and Jews out of certain neighborhoods. So we can look at insurance maps and gain a lot of historical knowledge from looking at those and looking at architecture in different ways and how communities were built. But the problem is that buildings have a certain shelf life, and we've lost a lot of buildings here in both Fort Wayne and Allen County and throughout the state.
And so talk about the idea of what happens when these primary sources or materials aren't preserved and they're gone. What happens? What's the risk of that?
What is lost is lost. We lose that perspective, and we only have the predominant perspective. So we don't have the ability to critically analyze history, to critically analyze the facts that we had from the past, and look at it in an objective manner. If we're only preserving, this is one of the risks that you have if you're only preserving things from the top down and rather the bottom up. So that's why it's really important to have histories of people who worked in labor or people who worked in different industries that are less represented, peddlers, shop owners, because a lot of the histories that we have are people who sort of had the privilege and
like
the ability to write their histories or get a professional historian to actually take their ear because they were someone who sounded like they really mattered. But in reality, historians, it's not just the quote unquote winners of society, it's the society as a whole. It's the person that worked on the trolley car, it's the guy who was the cattle farmer, it's everybody who really matters and plays into part of the narrative of what we're trying to record.
And so obviously the Indiana Jewish Historical Society focuses on capturing the Jewish history of the Jewish people in Indiana from the beginning of the state, I guess, to today. So, and you've talked about that it's important because people need to realize that the Indiana Jewish community, despite being small, even on a state level, let alone here in Fort Wayne, that they may be small, but they've made large contributions in all parts of Indiana. So can you tell me some of those examples of some of the different people in the Jewish community throughout the state and how they've made a difference in Indiana?
Sure. So I think the person who probably made the biggest difference, in my humble opinion, would probably be Friedrich Niefler, who was a general in the Union Army. He was a brevet general, one of the highest ranking Jewish officers in the Union Army.
This is during the Civil War.
During the American Civil War, and he fought alongside Lew Wallace, who was a good friend of his, and Lew Wallace actually encouraged him to join. He was actually in the Hungarian Revolution of 1848 when he was around 15 years old. And in Hungary, there was a lot of political instability, and many Jews wanted to side with the Hungarian side to break away from the Austrian Empire. And because of that, many of the Jews who were involved in that revolution, they decided to leave Europe Russia came to Austria's aid. They lost. And so many Jews ended up coming with non-Jews who were involved in the revolution to America. And they used their military skills and their military prowess that they learned in the war. And Friedrich Niefler ended up in Indianapolis. His father was a physician. He first of all started out as a woodworker and then eventually became a lawyer. And when he joined, he moved up from being a lieutenant all the way up to a general during the war. He actually faced off in Georgia in a key battle. I'm trying to remember the battle, but he charged up the middle when the Confederate forces thought that he would go around the sides. He just went right up the middle, charged up, and split General Bragg's forces into two. And this led to General Sherman's march to the sea. Down through Atlanta to Savannah.
Right.
But really, he was the spearhead. Really his tenacity of leading up the middle, as an officer, inspired the soldiers around him. Inspired Lew Wallace, the great author who wrote Ben-Hur, and he even relieved Lew Wallace in combat when he became too shell-shocked. Governor Morton told Friedrich Niefler to take over for Lew Wallace, who was probably one of the most famous generals from Indiana. So Friedrich Niefler here is a Jewish immigrant from Hungary, born in Arad, Hungary. It's now part of Romania. His family helped to found the Indianapolis Hebrew congregation, the oldest synagogue in Indianapolis. And he was actually there when they wrote when they wrote their first bylaws. He was present there, and he became a big deal after the Civil War. He worked with the Pensions Bureau, and he had some back and forth about policy with the U.S. government that kind of got himself into hot water because he had strong opinions about pensions. Eventually, he was asked by the governor to take over the commission to build the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. And it was 20 years behind. And they had all these engineers and designers who had come from Germany, from Leipzig, and he spoke German, and he was wonderful at logistics. He was amazing at getting things that needed to be where they needed to be. He was an organizer, and he got these designers together. He got everyone where they needed to be. And he had diabetes. He was in terrible shape. This is towards the end of his life. And they laid the cornerstone there. And one of the things that he noticed is that all of the soldiers there on the monument had very German-looking beards. And he told all the designers in German, they look too German. You have to get rid of the beard. So if you look at the Soldiers and Sailors Monument and you see where they have nicks where the beards
they got a little
were.
shave.
Exactly. Otherwise they would look like Prussian soldiers in his opinion. So they laid the cornerstone of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, and then he died in 1901, and it was completed in 1902. But if it wasn't for his efforts, the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, in my opinion, would not look like it is today, and probably would have been years and years behind. If not, maybe they would not even completed it, because it was very ambitious at the time. And it's really the identity that we have as Hoosiers. What's the first thing you think of when you think of Indiana? Most Hoosiers think of what? Basketball, Rudy, Bobby Knight, but mostly they think of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument in Indianapolis. And Niefler had such a huge part in that, such a huge role, and he was so respected. There's stories that one story where he was leading a parade of Civil War veterans, and he fell off of his saddle. He fell off the horse, and he was in old age, and he just got back up on the horse and kept on riding. That's the kind of person he was. Just stubborn, tenacity, never quit, and had a spirit like none other. And so many people, if there's one prominent Indiana Jewish Hoosier that people should know, they should know General Friedrich Niefler, or Fred Niefler as he was
Okay.
also known.
But let's expand it out a little bit
Sure,
and say
sure.
beyond just one.
Sure.
What's some other significant, and there is some significance also with Fort Wayne in terms of the history of Indiana's Jewish community and its development. So let's talk about some other Indiana Jewish Hoosiers that we should
Sure.
know, and then also let's talk about the connection with Fort Wayne.
So, you know, we were founded here in Fort Wayne, the Indiana Jewish Historical Society, and Fort Wayne itself, if you look at where it is on a map between the three rivers, it was a key trading destination. And there was a gentleman by the name of John Jacob Hayes, and he probably was one of the first 4 Jews in Indiana. He came from a Sephardic background. His family were some of the first Jews to arrive in North America to New York, and they formed Sherith Israel. One of his relatives was a loyalist to the British, and because of that, his family's name was stained. And so he felt that he had to change his fortune by becoming an Indian agent out in the West. And so he came out to Illinois, and he was the registered Indian agent, and he eventually came to Fort Wayne, which was a strategic post working with Native Americans. And my predecessor, Joe Levine, wrote a book on Hayes. And what's fascinating about Hayes is that because there were so few Jews in the state, obviously he couldn't marry someone who was Jewish. But his descendants kept, and we're very proud of their descendants' Jewish past. They kept his phylacteries, his tefillin, the boxes that
Right.
you wrap around the
prayer,
arm,
right.
and his talit, his prayer
So the things
shawl.
that he did for the practice, the rituals of the practice of prayer in Judaism.
And so he was still very proud of being Jewish, even though he married out of the faith, but he still maintained a Jewish identity. And this is something that's very different than in Europe, because if someone was to marry out of the faith, they would have to get married by a minister, and obviously they would have to convert to Christianity. And so in America, that wasn't so. There wasn't a state religion sanctioning that you have to go to a priest or a pastor and convert before you can marry someone who's not Jewish. Typically, that person would convert. They would join another religion. But in America, it was possible that someone could still be Jewish and yet marry someone who's not Jewish, and still maintain, be Jewish, which is just something that didn't exist really in Europe at all.
And then talk about the importance of the current day congregation, Achduf Shalom, in the history of Indiana's Jews.
So Achduf Shalom has a very, very storied history. It goes back to 1848, and it was actually established as an Orthodox synagogue. And what I mean by Orthodox, by a group of German-speaking Jews. One of them was from the Nerdlinger family, and they still had kosher slaughter there. They had a ritual circumciser there called a moil in Hebrew, and they had teachers who would come that knew Hebrew and German. And we know all this from different advertisements from 2 different competing newspapers, one called The Occident and one called the American Israelite. And the American Israelite was written by a rabbi, a self-designated rabbi. He never had formal religious training, named Isaac Mayer Wise. And the other one was written by a man whose last name was Leeser. And Leeser was from the Orthodox opinion, and he wrote the Occident, which was in Philadelphia, and Wise wrote from his own Reform perspective in Cincinnati. And so these became the 2 competing views. This was a tug of war between the hearts of these small communities.
In terms of the establishment of Judaism in America.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So this was a battle for a very small Jewish community. Very tiny. We're talking about a few thousand people here, but they both had very different visions of what American Judaism should be. So Leeser wrote an entire translation of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible,
the Torah,
into English, so that people could understand, but he still wanted them to be observant Jews in the Orthodox style.
As it was practiced in Germany.
Right.
So they wanted them to bring everything from the rituals and the traditions and the practice and the melodies. All was going to be from Germany. They just wanted to bring that to the United States.
Right. All these movements, I want to emphasize, you're correct, all come from German-speaking backgrounds.
Right.
So even the Reform movement was
Right.
formed in Hamburg in 1818.
Right.
But Wise wanted to even further Americanize the Reform movement to fit American values, to help people fit into American society, even more than the Hamburg Temple did, which was considered very radical at the time.
Right. So Rabbi Wise had a vision of really sort of making American Reform Judaism more part of that, it would fit into their new lives, right?
Right. That's in his viewpoint.
Right. So talk about how when he tried to create a rabbinical school, how he looked at what some of the Christian faiths, how they sort of created their ministries or schools for the priests, and then also talk about the significance of Indiana in terms of the establishment of the American Reform Jewish movement.
So both Wise and Leeser obviously were worried about Jews who are going out to the West, we think about these little towns and cities, and how are they going to maintain their Judaism?
Right, this is all because you have to think about the immigration. If everybody came sort of through New York or through the East Coast, and then as they, it's expansion, manifest destiny, going westward, these were unknown territories and people were setting them up, and so they weren't necessarily taking that structure with them as we migrated.
It was a combination of train lines and rivers.
Right.
First it was rivers.
Right.
First it was peddlers who were coming into territories, and then when rail lines came in, and Isaac Mayer Wise was a master of writing the rails to different communities,
right.
and he would write about different communities he thought that had potential. And so back to Fort Wayne.
But go back to the fact that when he tried, how he looked at what the Christian faiths did to train their leaders.
In his newspapers and his writings, he got into a lot of debates over theology, and he tried to engage with different Christian groups. He was in Cincinnati, which was the first large Jewish community in the West, which is right next to Indiana. It had one of the largest Jewish communities in America at the time, but he was directly engaged with many Protestant and Catholic German speakers because he came from a German-speaking background himself in what's now the Czech Republic, and he saw that, if you're not having these debates, these theological debates, then he was afraid that people would just convert to Christianity, that there wasn't this special alternative to being Jewish,
right.
an alternative to Leeser's Judaism, because it's harder to get access to kosher meat. It's harder to find a ritual circumciser,
right.
Things of that nature.
But he also, you told me that he also looked at it that when he was trying to create the Hebrew Union College, which was going to be a rabbinical school to train American rabbis, which was very important because they would have been grown up in America and sort of
professionalize. He wanted to professionalize them, right. And give them credentials and give them, because like you were saying, pastor has ordination,
right.
So they have professional stature,
right. And then
in marriage and all these other things, and so. Fort Wayne is the city of churches. It takes religion very seriously.
Right.
And so you have a Jewish community that's looking at this tension between the orthodoxy that they had and this new reform movement. And I want to say that Isaac Mayer Wise had a very bold vision.
Right. But the point is that two things. One is that he also looked at how the churches came together, like all the Lutheran churches and all the Episcopalian churches, and then
like a synod that
right,
like
and
Lutherans
that's what helped
had.
to support
Correct.
the schools to teach their spiritual leaders. So he emulated that when he looked to create Hebrew Union College, that he would have various congregations become members of this union to help support when his rabbinical graduates, right? But even so, that he took in that model. But there was also the importance that without this one gentleman in Indiana, the whole Hebrew Union College and this rabbinical school would have never been established.
So there was a Mr. Adler from Lawrenceburg, Indiana, who was a good friend of Isaac Mayer Wise, who gave him $10,000.
Which at that time would be what, the equivalent of a couple million, right?
I'd have to see how much that would be. But a lot of people didn't believe in having a Hebrew Union College, or formally, they didn't see the reason why you'd have to ordain a rabbi.
Right.
Most of the people that were Jewish leaders were sort of people that just had a lot of anecdotal Jewish knowledge. They could lead prayers in Hebrew. They were called ministers often,
right,
even though they weren't the equivalent of a Christian minister. They were really a lay leader that had a lot of Jewish education.
And at that time, also, a lot of the spiritual readings were done in German.
Correct.
So they weren't done in English.
A little bit in that span of time between the Reform movement that didn't quite get to Wise. I mean, what Wise wanted to do was that he wanted to standardize something called Minhag America, his own prayer book that
right,
had lots of English, that had lots of readings in English, shorter Hebrew, a shorter service, more decorum.
Well, he also wanted, he also took some of the things that he liked from church services,
Mm-hmm.
like choirs, mm-hmm, and having an organ and music and melodies.
I mean, the Hamburg Temple in Germany already had choirs and an organ and was sort of similar to a Lutheran
service. But bringing that to the United States, and when you only had the Orthodox, that was really radical at the time.
it was considered pretty radical.
Right. And so this relationship with Indiana and Hebrew Union College, which is in Cincinnati, continued. So talk about where, again, Congregation Akdei V'Shalom played a role in that history and the formation.
So, going back a few steps back, so there was this tension within Akdei V'Shalom between Orthodoxy and Reform.
And there was also a tension between the immigrants that were German.
Well, that comes a bit later.
No, but I know, but I'm just trying to, and then there was also from the Eastern European Jews as well. So there was lots of tension.
This happens chronologically a bit before that. In about 10 years, you could start talking about that. But right at this point, we're really only talking mostly about German-speaking Jews.
Okay.
A few years later, you're right, this becomes the elephant in the room. But at this point, it's really the tension between, and this happens in places like Evansville, this happens in Lafayette, and you can see this in these articles in the Occident and the American Israel, this tension going back between the followers of Isaac Mayer Wise and the people who dissent. So there's even Reform dissenters that don't like Isaac Mayer Wise.
Right.
Inside of the congregation, Isaac Mayer Wise ultimately wins out. It becomes like his model congregation, and one of the first graduate of the Hebrew Union College becomes the first ordained rabbi in America who goes to Akdei V'Shalom, which is the first Jewish congregation in Indiana.
And one of the charter members of this union.
Of the Hebrew, yes.
Right.
And so this is a seminal event in American Jewish history, and it happened here in Fort Wayne, that really the rabbinate was professionalized in a manner that fit Isaac Mayer Wise's vision for America, which was called Minhag America, otherwise known as the American custom.
Right.
So in Europe, you had Minhag Sfarad for Spain, and Minhag Ashkenaz for Germany. And so this was Minhag, the traditions of America for Jews that he wanted to create, and customs that he wanted to build, because he saw that America is different from the rest of the Jewish world. It has a different place in history.
Well, and also because, partly also, there was some things like you talked about, being able to marry someone out of a faith, because America was also new. So some people were like, well, let's try something different. We're new. So talk about this whole idea, though, of one of the things that why in Indiana, especially in Fort Wayne, where it was, a lot of the Jews started as peddlers or, scrap metal people and sort of fur trading, and they sort of would have a route and a path, and then they sort of would find somewhere that they would want to live and settle down, and then they saw that they could then open a retail, like a little merchant and build. And part of that in Fort Wayne, the acceptability of that they were Jewish was because they spoke German. So talk about how that really helped to sort of fortify the opportunities for Jews, in the Midwest and in Indiana and Fort Wayne that maybe they wouldn't have had in other places because of the fact that non-Jews and Jews spoke German.
So a lot of non-Jews who were immigrating en masse in much bigger numbers than Jews to Indiana and the Midwest, they shared the same values of having the Enlightenment. There was an Enlightenment that was going on, and they saw what happened in the 1840s as a failure to achieve that the old ways, the old order of Europe wasn't changing. And so many of them were inspired to leave, and they were of a certain mindset that was similar to many Jews who were coming. And when they came to America, they decided, we're not going to have things just like they were in Europe anymore. We're going to invite Jews to join our gymnastics society, or to go fencing with us, or to join even our choral groups. So there were German choral groups that Jews joined. In South Bend, in the early days of the German-speaking Jewish community there, they were really integrated with the other non-Jewish German immigrants. Think of it in terms of like this mosaic of Catholics and Protestants and Jews. So you have a synagogue and a cathedral and a church, and they're all lined up in this vision that people had of the German Enlightenment that they brought here. And they had similar values in that sense, and they did things together that would not have been possible in Europe because the order of things, the pecking order of how Jews were not part of the society. They weren't really citizens in many instances, and so when Jews came to America, they saw an opportunity to knock on doors, and they would stay with non-Jewish families, and they would try foods they had never tried before, and they became the ambassadors of Jews to families that had never met a Jew before.
Right.
This is a totally alien experience to them. Even if they're immigrants from Europe, they had probably preconceived notions of what a Jew is, and then actually meeting someone who's Jewish changed their lives. So,
and that also partly with the reform was the fact that they still were identifying and recognized themselves as Jewish, but maybe they weren't doing the practices of like keeping kosher or things like that, so that they could eat in the homes of people that they were invited to, or trying foods that they didn't. So they sort of also were able to separate some of the rituals of the practice of Judaism from what it meant to be Jewish, and they could still continue to be Jewish, which was also some of what happened with the evolution of American Jewry.
So what they would say, what Isaac Mayer Wise would say is they're practicing the prophetic ideas of Judaism instead of Jewish law, and he, at certain points there were different tensions on what that would look like, and during the abolition period, Isaac Mayer Wise, perhaps, he didn't take a strong stance on the issue. He was so big on his vision, he really didn't get involved in the local political scene, and there were rabbis within the reform movement that wanted abolition.
Right, so talk about, there was one very significant rabbi in Indiana, Rabbi Bernhard Felsenthal. Talk about him and his role with abolitionists.
So he came originally from Germany, and he came, what would become Germany, and he came and he settled down in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. He was a teacher there. He had some yeshiva training, but he was not formally ordained as a rabbi. He had a brilliant mind. He became the you could call him a rabbi of of Madison, Indiana, the Jewish leader. And Madison, Indiana had a really interesting dynamic. So you had some people that liked the Reform movement, some people who were Orthodox, some people who came from different dialects of German.
And some people that were German and the Eastern European, but that was happening everywhere, wasn't it? Or not to the extent.
Most of these communities, some of them were big enough that they even had separate communities between the two at this point. But Madison was too small to do that. And Madison is really close to the Kentucky border. And there were a lot of people who were pro-slavery on the other side. And so being an abolitionist at that time in the 1850s was very controversial. There were a few people who invited him to become a rabbi in Alabama, and he said, absolutely not, I'm not doing that, I'm an abolitionist, I'm not moving to Alabama. And he didn't really fit the culture, according to his daughter, and he eventually became a banker in Chicago for a while, and then started the largest Reform congregation, the first Reform congregation called Sinai Temple on the south side of Chicago. And many of his congregants came from LaPorte, Indiana. And it's interesting that he made some ventures back in Indiana. He actually dedicated the first synagogue in Ligonier, Indiana, before the temple that still stands there today was dedicated by Isaac Mayer Wise. And they were rivals on politics and what the Reform movement should look like and what should be reformed. He lived long, Bernard Felsenthal lived long enough to see even the beginning of political Zionism. So he really, he's everything from the Enlightenment in Germany all the way, through the Civil War and abolition to really the beginnings of the south side of Chicago to the beginnings of political Zionism. So this is a huge, he also helped start the Jewish Publication Society and the Jewish Historical Society that exists today. And so we really owe a debt of gratitude, even though he wasn't in Indiana for that long. He was in Indiana maybe 3 to 5 years maximum.
Right, but also looking at the role that a Jewish rabbi, took a stance with as an abolitionist. There's also a historical relationship with Jews, American Jews in general, with the civil rights that some people don't realize that that Jews really were instrumental. So just from the perspective, not necessarily of Indiana, but just touch on that a second, because I don't think people really see that connection.
So if you went through the JCRC archives, in the JCRC, what they do...
What does the JCRC stand for?
They are sort of...
What is the acronym? Do you know?
I'll explain what they do.
Okay.
I think it's more important what they do.
Okay.
What they do is they work with the non-Jewish community, and they work as an advocate for the Jewish community with the State House on a city, and also with the city of Indianapolis. And they used to have 2 institutions. They used to have one that was a statewide organization and one that was just for Indianapolis. Now the city organization works for the entire state. And now what they did in the 1960s was that they felt that as a Jewish Rights Commission, they worked with African Americans to break down different barriers, because back then there were still covenanted areas that Jews and blacks could not live in. There were certain country clubs that restricted
at higher education. There were certain areas that Jews and blacks couldn't live. Jews couldn't necessarily get mortgages for homes in certain. I mean, there was some they both faced institutional and systemic.
So there was that natural, but there was also about voting rights. So. So they took it upon themselves to work with several local rabbis, Rabbi Maurice Davis from Indianapolis at IHC, and several other rabbis in Indiana and Gary, Indiana. There was a Rabbi Miller who was also instrumental in working with Martin Luther King. And the JCRC sent members down, like their executive director, went to the South to ensure that African Americans
That was part of the Freedom Riders.
Part
right?
of the Freedom Riders, yes, to ensure that they would be able to vote. And because democracy was such an important value for the Jewish community, and that if not everyone in American society could participate equally in voting, then we're conflicting with both American values and with Jewish values. And so they took this is when local law enforcement was attacking people, and
Right.
and freedom riders were murdered. And this is a very far, this is Indianapolis and people going into the Deep South.
Right.
So if you go through our archives, and their organizations evolved, what they deal with and the different issues that they
Sure.
deal with are very different
Sure.
throughout the
Sure,
decades,
yeah.
and see an evolution of that.
Right.
But during that period, their executive director, and the name
That's okay.
is going over my mind right now, really believed that ensuring the right to vote was a Jewish priority at the
And
time.
talk about also the involvement of some rabbis going back a little bit with the KKK in Indiana.
So one of the things that a lot of people don't
And
understand.
that period of time was what? When the KKK.
In the 1920s.
1920s,
Thank you
okay.
for setting up that time. So we're going back in time again.
We're
going from the 1960s back to the 1920s.
But again, what we're showing is how the Jewish community really stood up for other marginalized or minority communities, because one, because they themselves face that, and two, because it is part of what the value of Judaism is, that you stand up for everybody to have the rights to live and worship and do what they want to do.
Correct.
So in the 1920s, when the KKK really was very entrenched in Indiana, and talk about how the KKK sort of wedged its way in, its tactics and things.
So if you read James Madison, Professor Madison, he's written extensively about the Klan in Indiana, and that's a really good source to go with. And I'll just kind of reiterate some of the things that he said.
Abridged version.
But if you go through the archives, it really stands to be true that the Klan, the way that they utilize political power and the way that they threaten people, not necessarily through physical violence, but through boycotts.
And coerce them to
And to coerce them, cross burnings, marching through the middle of the city. And you have these small towns where you have Jewish merchants, and their only source of income is selling shoes or selling clothes. And imagine if someone threatens you to boycott you if you speak out against them. Well, your whole livelihood is gone. And so a lot of Jewish communities business people couldn't rise up against the Klan because their businesses would be finished. And the Klan would relish the opportunity to, drive Jews out of the state. So the group that really took the lead, because they had really nothing to lose. I mean, what are you going to do? Boycott their synagogue, boycott their temple? So rabbis, particularly from the Reform movement in places like Terre Haute and Hammond, Indiana, and Fort Wayne itself, and Indianapolis, they got together with Catholic priests, Protestant ministers, and they talked to them, and they said, look, we have to stand up against them because they're going to destroy the state. They control the state house, they control the governor, and they want to drive all the Catholics and all the Jews and all the African Americans out of the state. And in different meaningful ways. So for example, in Hammond, Indiana, F.W. Du Bois was invited to come to the Bethel Hammond Forum to speak about civil rights in the 1920s. This is F.W. Du Bois. In an amazing story, amazing vignette that happened in Terre Haute, and I'm trying to remember the rabbi's name. The Klan accosted him because he was running a major charity in Terre Haute, and they challenged him to a debate. And so they figured that this rabbi would be in inarticulate buffoon. I don't know why they would assume that, because they believe their own propaganda, perhaps if you read their propaganda. So the rabbi bravely took them up on it. He met them in a public space and started, like, you know, they let him like speak to him. And when he was done, he was so articulate. This is how the story goes. This could be just, you know, I've read several different sources for this. The Klan actually donated to the rabbi's non-Jewish charity afterwards. He saw some names that he recognized that he knew were for sure Klans members. So they bravely stood up to them. They wouldn't take anything from them. They knew that if they didn't stand up to them, the business people certainly couldn't, who were the bulwark of the community. And so they knew that they had to do something, and they did it, even though it was scary. I mean, these people are marching in robes and burning things and burning crosses and changing laws. I mean, changing the laws of the state of Indiana against immigrants.
Right.
You know, attacking, you know, the Catholics all over the states. I mean, Jews were a smaller group in Indiana, so Jews were not. I don't want to say that Jews were the main target of the Klan. It was more Catholic immigrants, but Jews were also a target, and Jews were constantly mentioned in the Klan's newspapers. The Ku Klux Klan ran a newspaper in Indianapolis, and their brochures and their propaganda, they appeared over and over again as an obsession of the Klan.
They would say, like, you know, there were signs, no blacks, no Jews, no dogs. I mean, Jews were thrown in as well as something that they were anti.
But that's interesting, because before then, the Klan, the Jews were not really a focus of the Klan. The Klan came out of the South out of Reconstruction.
Right.
And when the Klan, we could call the 1920s Klan the variant B strain of the Klan.
Right.
Like almost a different, you know, a disease, but a disease that afflicts in a different way.
Right, because it was different than the Klan in the South. But what they also, why I think the Jews sort of became part of their focus in Indiana was because during the 1920s, that was really the start when you saw all of these peddlers and these merchants be able to begin to build retail establishments and really become, it was the start of the Jewish communities going beyond just the Jewish community and becoming prominent within the greater communities in which they lived.
It's right that you saw the emergence of different prominent Jews in different communities, but I think what the Klan was really hating was the fact that this was the era of mass migration. So you had many Jews who are coming from what we'd call Eastern Europe now, Central Europe, who spoke Yiddish, who looked different,
right,
who stood out more than the Jews who came before, who spoke German, and this created a problem for people. You know, that
it was also the time when the United States government, that was when they implemented quotas and limitations of immigration, was in the 1920s. It was 1923, because they started to see the numbers of Eastern European Jews that were coming to this country.
If you could believe it, that so the German-speaking Jewish establishment of the time, their solution is actually really creative. It's actually the opposite of what you would assume. So you would assume that they would want to keep Jews out of going into areas, Yiddish-speaking Jews from going to the middle of nowhere, so to speak, out to the field. Their philosophy was actually the complete opposite of that. To assimilate the Jewish population, there were a group of German-speaking Jewish philanthropists who came together that created what's called the IRO, the Industrial Removal Organization, that actually recruited Jews, promising them jobs in different remote places so that they would more quickly assimilate into places like Terre Haute or even Elwood, Indiana, places that you wouldn't expect Jews to be sent to by other Jews. And so they were ending up in these small little places. But, I've always, wondered, I've listened to oral histories and things like that, how scary it must have been for them with this growing nativist movement that was just really new to America. I want to say that, for most of Indiana's history, Indiana has been very good to its Jewish community overall. the state hasn't experienced widespread anti-Semitism or virulent anti-Semitism like in Europe. Many Jews are very grateful for coming here and living in Indiana, but there were different periods that the climate was negative and toxic for different immigrant groups in general, including Jews. And I mean, I think that, you know, certain Americanized Jews who had risen to prominence had a position within the society that allowed them to pivot more than a new immigrant who barely spoke English, who just came to Indiana. So there was a delicate balance, and they felt that they had an obligation to help their brothers and sisters out who had a different dialect.
Right, and that's continued. I mean, you know, you sort of said that Fort Wayne in many ways can be looked at as a microcosm of what's happening and what has happened within the American Jewish community at large. And so even in Fort Wayne, I mean, they helped with the resettlement of lots of people after World War II. And then when there was the refuseniks, the former Soviet Union Jews, they brought 100 individuals here to help them resettle. I mean, they've always sort of continued that work of, you know, Jews of helping others resettle and you know, helping them sort of create a life. But we've also seen sort of what's happening now with American Jewry is just and paralleling it even to Fort Wayne. I mean, at its height, the Fort Wayne Jewish community was only 1,200 people, and now it's probably not even 400 people. So we're sort of seeing that wane, but it's really what I think is so incredible is what, you know, Pew did this research study, and they asked the average people, what percentage of the American population do you think is Jewish? And the answers were between 20 to 30%. We are not even now, we're like 1.9% of the American population. But what you can see, not only in the microcosm of Fort Wayne, but in Indiana, is the incredible impact that this very small group of people have had, not only in, like you said, the Civil War and in politics, but also in the development of arts and cultural organizations and social justice organizations. And so there really is, although we continue to wane in numbers, there really still is, just like at the start in Indiana, which is a small group of people who really have had a big impact. Would you agree that that's true?
Yeah, I think that there definitely have been, you know, philanthropists in Indiana's history who have been Jewish, who have done tremendous work for the state of Indiana.
And continue to this day.
And for Fort Wayne, yeah, and continue to this day. I would think that, you know, it's interesting, you look at Jewish philanthropy, which is a fascinating topic in itself, and how much, you know, there's a tension in the Jewish world between the universal and the particular.
Right, because there was the belief, like when I was growing up, we supported Jewish causes and organizations because if we didn't, who will? So you focus there, but there was also the commitment to making the community better for everyone as well. So you did have that, also that philanthropy and giving to the greater community.
And you know, whether it's universities or hospitals or any number of other projects, Jewish philanthropists have been involved and taken the lead in different areas. But I mean, I think really the bigger story, because there are Jewish philanthropy in many states and many cities, really the story about Indiana is that Indiana is sort of this place of constant migration, where people come, are born or live or educated, spend a few years, develop a certain time, and then they go on to someplace else. And so this is a general, you know, the guy who wrote, I'm forgetting his last name, he wrote Take Me Out to the Ball Game. He wrote the melody to it. He was born in Indianapolis and then moved out to New York not long after he was born.
Right.
Von Sulzer, I think is his last name.
Okay.
Everyone thinks he's German, but he's Jewish and he was born in Indianapolis. So there are so many phenomenal people who were born or raised in Indiana and they have no idea, you know, what their background was or what they did, and you know, it's fascinating when you talk to different people. for example, 2 Nobel Prize winners were both born in Gary, Indiana, and both of them are Jewish in economics.
Right, and that's partly your work with the Indiana Jewish Historical Society, and you have the the Hoosier Jewish Legends, where you recognize these individuals. And as you are going to enter your 50th year, you're going to continue that work, and really the importance of not only for the Jewish community to preserve and educate, but also for the Indiana community as well, to understand again that a very small group of people have a big impact. And I think it sort of parallels that fact that as one individual, you can, you may be small, but you can make a big difference. Yeah.
I think the best example of this is if you go to Lafayette, Indiana, and you go to the old town, the old area from the 1850s, 1840s, and you can just go down the list of businesses and houses from the antebellum period, and the temple that was built in the mid 1860s. It's the oldest still standing synagogue in Indiana. You can really see the early impact of the German-speaking Jewish community there. Their cemetery is still there since the 1840s.
Well, the same thing in Fort Wayne. We have the Jewish cemetery here. But it's really seeing that, and that's partly understanding that in every group, I mean, it's not just Jews, obviously we're focusing on it, but every group you can look at their history and their impact, and really, it's so important to understand where we came from, so also we can know where we're going.
I think a lot of people don't even realize a lot of these individuals are Jewish.
Right, well that's also, yeah.
I mean, a lot of people, if you talk about the Loebs or the Loeb Mansion, they just assume they're German, or even Friedrich Niefler. A lot of people claim him as being Hungarian or even German.
Right.
They have no idea that the person is Jewish.
And that's why it's important for us to preserve this history.
Right.
So at the end of each And Good Company program, I ask guests the same 12 questions that French novelist Marcel Proust popularized from a Victorian parlor game. What is your favorite word?
Wow, this is hard. Elusive.
What is your least favorite word?
Abstract.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Awe.
What turns you off creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Frustration.
What sound or noise do you love?
The wind.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Loud country music.
That was very specific. What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Teacher.
What profession other than your own would you not like to attempt?
Working in the sewer system.
Who, living or dead, would you most like to have a conversation with?
This is really a hard one. I'd like to talk to Albert Einstein.
How would you like to die?
In my sleep.
Okay.
On a Saturday.
Okay. Specifically on a Saturday.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it brings you great honor if you die on Shabbat in Judaism. So.
Okay. I think they just
Peacefully.
do that. It's like when they would tell you that it's a good omen if your wedding's on a rainy day. It's just make you feel better.
Well, you didn't have any plans made before for it to mess up. So.
Right, that's true. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
You're in.
Well, I want to thank you for coming and having a seat at our table and helping us understand some of the history and the importance of collecting these stories.
Thank you. Very welcome.
Thank you. And you can learn more about And Good Company and all the other interesting conversations we have had at andgoodcompany.info. And we look forward to next week when you can again enjoy a seat at the table for great conversation and good company.